today, and we're very fortunate to have some industry leaders participating on the call, including Sal Trippi from Publishers Clearinghouse, longtime OTA member, and who's contributed significantly to the methodology over the past several years. Jeff Wilbur from Iconics, also been a principal author of the report and has worked through it over the past several years on the methodology, the scoring, and such. So Jeff and Sal, thank you very much, and welcome to today's call. So I do want to encourage everyone today, as mentioned earlier, that the call is, we are recording the call, the webinar, and to please use the chat menu an option to submit any comments you might have. So for those of you who don't know, the Online Trust Alliance, we're a 501c3 organization. This is the 7th year we have embarked on this report, and it really is consistent with our goals and our methodologies of really providing businesses prescriptive and actionable advice to help better advance their practices and, most importantly, protect consumers' security and privacy. So we're very fortunate for the numbers and organizations that have supported us and throughout this endeavor. So the honor roll, as I mentioned, this is the 7th year, and we have several key objectives here of this report. It's really an audit, and Jeff will be sharing in just a moment details about it. But our goals are really to get business leaders to move from a compliance mindset, meaning the minimal amount you need to do, to one of stewardship. We also want to recognize companies that are doing the right thing. This is about positive affirmation and recognize leadership in many different areas, because we think that's really important. We want this to be an incentive to do the right thing. We're constantly asked who's doing the worst thing, worst performance, and that's not consistent with our mission or our values as an organization. It's, again, it's about the positive affirmation. And ultimately, our goal is we want to see security and privacy get more integrated with the organizations and our brand's value proposition to consumers. And the last 2 points, and I think Sal will get into it here, and Sal, you certainly can share your points, is the educational value and how this helps. Do you have any comments, Sal?
Yeah, I think one of the values we get as an organization out of the OTA is not only participating in the various member sessions and getting knowledge about what's going on in the industry, but the real actionable information we get about our own practices and our own sites. We use the OTA audit as an annual check-in for us, and we're trying to do it more and more often, where we learn, and as the bar increases, we use it to gain new knowledge, to help us implement new technologies to keep our members safe and keep our sites safe. And as a member of OTA, I can, you know, Jeff and Craig and the staff at the OTA are very responsive to helping us and answering questions and working with us so that we can continue to raise the bar as the bar on the honor roll continues to raise. Right.
Great. Well, thank you. Jeff, do you want to kind of share a little bit the methodology and the background here?
Sure. I'll go through this at a high level, and then we'll peel into each of those 3 categories in the Venn diagrams as we reveal our findings in each area. So we looked at about 1,000 websites this year, and you can see the different sectors that we looked at: banking, retailers, social, news and media, which we introduced last year, federal government, which we've tracked several years, but this year we also looked at their privacy policies, so they, for the first time, qualified for the honor roll itself. OTA members, which we always audit ourselves, and then the new sector this year was the Internet of Things, top 50, roughly divided half between home automation products and wearable technologies. And to make the point that we didn't look at the devices themselves, we looked at the companies providing these devices and what their practices were in these 3 major areas. So we look at baseline points up to 100 in each of the 3 categories you see there: brand protection, security, and privacy. And then we have bonuses and penalties in each category: bonuses for emerging best practices that don't quite qualify for a baseline categorization yet, and penalties for things like data breaches or the FCC fines or settlements or practices that are inadequate. And to make the honor roll, you have to do two things. You have to get 80% or better of the total points allowed, so essentially 240 points of the 300. But you have to score 55% or better in each category because, we wanted to make sure that, the weakest link is the one that would make you fail. So you have to at least pass each category. So that's how we qualify people for the honor roll. So the way we went through this in developing the methodology is, and we've done this the last several years, late in the year prior, in this case it was November, we did an open call for comments about what should be included in the methodology, and we revealed what we had done this year. Then we published it in February, made a few tweaks along the way, and then in March we had a webinar and talked about the tools that you could use to self-assess so that companies could kind of prepare and adjust things if necessary to score as high as possible on the honor roll. We're not trying to make this hard to do. We're trying to get everybody up to this bar. And in the process of doing this, we solicited help from many of our members and some non-members. You see listed there in italics many companies who supply data in these various areas to help us gather the data and assess the criteria that we use in the audit.
Great, Jeff. I think one of the points here is that while we have some of our own tools and APIs and such that we've developed, we're relying on a lot of other technologies from companies throughout the world who are able to do scanning for us, analysis, and so combined, it's a very comprehensive review of a website's practices, configurations, and such. So great. Again, I want to thank all those companies.
So if we look at the high-level results this year, and remember there were almost 1,000 sites. In previous years, roughly 30% were making the honor roll, and this year we saw a huge jump up to 44%. We'll talk a bit about why that happened in a minute in more detail. It was a record level. Every year, our criteria gets raised in all three of those categories that we talked about earlier. The main reason that we saw for such a higher level of achievement this year was that there were a lot of companies, especially in Internet Retailer 500, which is the bulk of the organizations we audit, that were just below the bar in the previous couple of years, and they did just a few extra things to get them above the bar this year to achieve honor roll status. And they were fairly simple, straightforward improvements. If you had to pick one category where kind of people improved across the board, it was in their privacy policy statements and the points that were associated with that to kind of raise the average privacy score. We'll see that when we look at it. So here we're looking at all the sectors except OTA over the years, just to kind of see how things are trending from 2012 through 2015. And you can see that in every category, everyone was up this year. We break out the Internet Retailer 100 from the 500 just to see large versus, a broader set of retailers to see if there's a difference in their scoring. So we break that in most of our charts. Then we have the banks, the social networks, and so forth. So in every sector, there was kind of a record score, although there are some concerns, especially there you see the news sector, only 4% achieved honor roll last year, doubled to 8%, but still very, very low, needs a lot of attention. And we'll look at why people didn't make the honor roll here in a moment. The Internet of Things, the new sector that we looked at this year, 20% achieved honor roll status, which is well below the average. So there's work to be done there. And the Federal 50, which I said this is the first year we've looked at them in an honor roll sense, actually came in right around the average at 42%. So it's moving in the right direction, even though we're raising the criteria each year.
Well, great. Well, one thing that we want to appreciate that, and we can certainly come back to some questions on the details. We want to drill down the details. But every year we recognize the organization that has a #1 score, total score across all the sites. And once again, Twitter has taken the lead. across all sectors there. So congratulations to the team at Twitter. And one point to call out, and it's also, as we look at some of these other companies and organizations, they've all been forward-thinking. If we think about the lower part of the slide, American Greetings, again, consistently it's the top-rated score among all retailers. Again, an organization that's very involved on collaboration and best practices. And across the government sites, the FDIC, and what's interesting is they've been pushing member banks to better secure their data and different practices. So they're walking the talk. Within the banking sector, USAA, like Bloomberg for news, and Dropcam within Internet of Things. So kudos to all these brands here. The other one here, just to let you know, we also do rank the top retailers and those within the top 10. And so we're seeing a huge number of names that we all know, but there's others that we haven't necessarily worked with in the past. So Netflix, for example, of the top 500 retailers is ranked number 6, I believe. And SparkFun is rated 490 something. And the point there is that achieving the top 10 status is not only for the biggest players like Netflix, but the smaller companies that have revenues around $20 million, SparkFun Electronics. So it's very, very significant there. So, and we've seen this year to year that the smaller companies are able to make the honor roll. Jeff, back to you. Okay.
So here we're comparing the 3 major categories, domain and brand protection, and just since we're almost there, so that's mainly email authentication and protecting your domain from abuse. The server SSL is your site security practices, and privacy, obviously, is your privacy practices. So we wanted to look at how sectors did against each other in these 3 main categories. And these are the average baseline scores out of the 100 points possible that we talked about, with no bonuses or penalties included. So you can see that if we go from left to right here, the domain brand category varies a lot. Is from the low of the Internet of Things at 38 to the high of OTA. You know, we're walking the talk as well within the OTA. You see the average is kind of there in the 60 range. And then this has to do with the thoroughness of your email authentication primarily. That's where most of the 100 points come from. You can see there is quite a bit of variation and a lot of work to be done, especially in the Internet of Things, federal, and the news sectors. And there's improvement to be made in other sectors as well. You go to the middle there, it's a pretty tight cluster for site security. Everyone's kind of doing the minimum level successfully. But then there are practices that kind of take you above the top there, and that's where some bonus points are available and things like that. So that's a fairly tight thing. Again, the Internet of Things is kind of lagging a bit. The average there, I think, is around 85. Again, led by the OTA members, because as you join, you're committed to following these best practices. And finally, on privacy, there's quite a bit of variation as well. Not as much in domain or brand, but still variation. And the news is lagging. That's mainly because, we'll see that in a minute, but all the tracking for advertisers that's done on their sites. The average overall, I think, is in the mid-70s. And you can see that the retailers are lagging a bit there. Most of the other sectors are at or above average.
Great. One thing, Jeff, is kind of interesting. I was somewhat surprised to see the server scores this high this year, only because the number of criteria had increased the bar. And so that was a very positive sign. I think that companies are taking more attention to their site security year to year.
Yeah, and I think as we've seen, and we'll comment on a bit more, most of that is not a matter of crazy new technologies. It's a matter of just the discipline of keeping up with configurations and the latest vulnerabilities and making sure you're keeping pace. So this is a new chart this year that we added to the report. We wanted to look at whether the range of scores, now this does include bonus points and penalties, so the average can be above 100 because of the bonuses. we wanted to look at what's the total range from bottom to top within a sector, and then the blue line there is the median score. So you can see that some of the sectors are kind of tight on their range, like the Internet Retailer 100 and OTA members are the narrowest. The Internet Retailer 500 and Internet of Things are probably the widest range. So you see that a lot of these medians are right at the 80 number, and that's the honor roll bar is 80. So you can see that the median, if you graph these, there's kind of a bell curve associated with them as well. So that's why we tend to see that it just takes a little bit to go above or below that honor roll line, and why we can see such a surge in achievement this year from 30 to 44% overall. There were about a 95 or so retailers that didn't make it in previous years that made it this year because they're so close to that line. This also means that going forward, since the bar gets raised every year in all three of these major categories, that it would be real easy to slip right below that bar of 80. So we can see some big swings in honor roll achievement just because the averages are so close to that honor roll line.
Well, that's a key point, Jeff. I guess it underscores it again. Yesterday's best practices won't be applicable in the future necessarily, and so it's that ongoing diligence is what Sal earlier mentioned about continually reassessing here. You know, the one thing that struck me here is the Internet of Things, and again, we're only talking about 50 companies. Seeing the wide range of disparity of these devices, I should say the companies that have leading devices, roughly slightly above 20 to in the 90s. So a huge range, and considering the sensitivity and the dynamic nature of the personal data that they're collecting on wearable technologies or your home, that's concerning. So we'll dig into that a little later here, but a huge concern in that category.
This is the final chart at kind of a high level, and here we're graphing in a stat. You know, the stack always adds up to 100%. The gold is how many made the honor roll, the red is how many failed, and then the blue is how many didn't do either. And you can see that every category is kind of bimodal. You either made the honor roll or you failed. There's not much in between, especially those on the left. You see that, you know, 40-ish or 50% make the honor roll or fail, and there's just a tiny slice in between. So that kind of shows how close they are. It also ties to our methodology of saying if you fail one category, you aren't going to make the honor roll. So, but it does show how companies are kind of on the edge, many of them, of just a few other best practices would put them over the top if they cleaned up their email authentication, for instance, or their privacy practices, would put them over the top. You see OTA again. We had 97%, you know, make the honor roll, 3% fail. That's just a couple members. And then in the news and Internet of Things sector, it's concerning how tall those failure bars are. You know, 75 to 80% failure rate. We'll look at why they failed in a minute, but that's something that's very concerning and needs some attention in both of those categories.
Yeah, Jeff, can you kind of articulate a little more about what fail means and the score that would constitute a fail?
Yeah, back to our high-level methodology. If you scored less than 55 out of 100 in any one of those broad categories of privacy, site security, or domain and brand protection, that was considered a failure. And so, now companies can fail in more than one category. And we've looked at all that data, but and here is the reasons for the failure by sector. So you can see if we start in the middle this time, you see that site security, their failures were pretty low. That corresponds to the higher average scores we saw on the previous slide. The Internet of Things had the highest failure rate here, but most of them were under 10% failed in the site security category, which is good. You see wide variation on the domain brand category. 70% of the Internet of Things organizations, companies failed because of poor email authentication. And we're going to look inside each of these categories at what comprises them. But that's a huge concern. And then if you just walk down the bars there, the news and the federal government categories did pretty poorly as well. Almost half the federal government organizations failed just due to email authentication practices. then you can walk on down. Retailers are actually doing quite well, as are social sites. If you go to the right side there, privacy, you can see the averages are a lot better than in the domain brand category, but there's still some spikes there. The news category is very poor, again, due to mainly to ad trackers that are on their websites. We saw some with over 200 ad trackers that had poor privacy practices themselves, the trackers. And then the retailers actually are next worst in terms of failures. And here the federal government as well. They have, good privacy policies and very little advertising on the sites, if any. And so they're very clean in a privacy sense.
Yeah, a few points to the Internet of Things was concerning because in some cases it was less about trackers, but the privacy policies were incomplete. They weren't in compliance with many regulatory requirements. In some cases, they were not discoverable. So again, they lost points there. It is concerning on the 70% of those Internet of Things that haven't adopted protocols to help protect from the spoofing of forged email, considering I'd suggest that those are going to become new targets for the criminals to go after because the rich amount of data and the ability to compromise a home network. So those are concerns we're going to look into. But let's drill down into the categories here. And this brand protection / consumer protection, as Jeff mentioned, a big focus is on email authentication. And it's really about protecting the consumer from the malicious or spoofed email that may be purported to be coming from the legitimate company. This is kind of the foundation of a lot of what the honor roll has worked on. This year we've moved the DMARC, which we'll get into in a second here. I'll let Sal explain. But this slide here is trying to show how the complexion of the points within that. So you get base points, and again, there's some emerging technology we think are very important, and TOS and such. And then there's penalty points here. But Sal, maybe you can kind of give me a little, as a interactive marketer, share your views of email authentication and how that fits into your marketing strategy and just your IT strategy.
Yeah, well, it's not an IT strategy. It's really a marketing strategy, and we look at it that way. When you think about SPF, DKIM, DMARC, they're ways of making sure other people do not pretend to be you. They're ways of blocking potential phishing emails and making sure the members that are receiving your emails or think they're receiving your emails are truly receiving emails from yourselves, from your brand. It's one of the most, we look at it as really a marketing and brand protection mechanism as opposed to a technology solution. Technology implements a solution, yeah, but pretty much everything we do in the online ecosystem, technology does. But when you think about, the number of companies that are not keeping up with the newest and latest and greatest authentication methods, it really is a little bit disappointing, especially for any major brand marketer. DMARC is a pretty powerful tool that, helps the ISPs weed out, fraudulent phishing type emails. If you ask any marketer, do you want to weed those type of emails out, 99 or 100% of them, I certainly would say absolutely. Why aren't we seeing it reflected in the DMARC scores? It's kind of puzzling, and I don't quite understand that. DMARC is not a complicated infrastructure to implement. It does take, the technology team, and it does build upon the SPF and DKIM, but it's a very powerful tool to prevent malicious emails from spoofing your brand and tarnishing your brand.
So, Sal, what does this cost?
Time, a little bit of time and effort, a little bit of time on the administrative setting up of the infrastructure.
The reason I asked that is I saw two people actually sent questions about that, and the point is these are open standards. There's no cost to you. A lot of this is stuff that you protocols or text files you put in your DNS. Almost all email marketing systems support DKIM. So again, there's really the obstacle for implementation is really, like Sal said, time here.
Yeah. And all major ASPs support DMARC. So it's really up to the brand and ensuring that your brand takes the time to set up and demand it correctly. If you're using an ESP and you don't have DMARC, the recommendation is demand it. And if you're not using an ESP, OTA has a wealth of resources available on its website to get the documentation and execute it. It really does not seem practical not to engage in business with the level of fraud that we see out there in the ecosystem. It doesn't make sense not to implement this to help combat it. Again, I'm speaking from a brand that's tends to be a highly phished brand, so I'm a little more passionate about it than others, perhaps. But it just seems an ounce of prevention is certainly worth a pound of cure.
Well, a good point there, and I think of concerning to OTA is if you look in that DMARC, only 24% of the top 100 banks have implemented, and a technology that has an approach that has provided such dividends and confirmed benefits, it is still disappointing that only a quarter of banks have adopted. So this slide here provides, a little more granular data. We actually track data going back for 7 years, but for purposes of presentation, we've only showed 4 years. So again, on the top, adoption of both SPF and DKIM is really essential. They're complementary technology protocols that really help provide almost an end-to-end verification. Is the email legitimate? And then the bottom chart here shows the growth of DMARC. And again, DMARC has grown. If you think about it as emerging a practice, and 3 years ago, it was at 1% for the banks, and so 24% is great growth. Sal, maybe you can share a little more insights on your views here, of perhaps what the issues are, or also the implementation of both standards for your systems.
Yeah, well, I think obviously implementation of SPF and DKIM are the basis, and those have been around for a lot longer than DMARC. DMARC came about, I believe, in 2011, Craig, am I correct?
It was January 2012 in which
okay, I'm a little bit off.
Public.
And it builds upon it. But along those lines, one of the common mistakes that I've seen, and Craig, maybe you could expand on it if it needs expanding, is it's not only the implementing the authentication on the domains that you're sending email from. Your corporate domain and your top level domain is really where phishers are going to prey upon. So, having a subdomain authenticated and leaving your top domain or a park domain unauthenticated really provides that feeding ground for phishers to attack. And that's really what this is all about. It's about building a defensive strategy, not only to authenticate what your mail is going out, but make sure the other domains, park domains and top-level domains, are set up with a reject policy telling the ISPs, do not deliver this if it doesn't pass either SPF or DKIM with the appropriate verifications. So that I think is where the value comes from. Putting it in to just notify without a reject, if you're not going to look at what's being done, is not going to yield any benefits, not going to protect any consumers. The consumer protection comes in when that mail, when we instruct the ISPs to reject that mail.
Well, great. I think it is the point here, question. So when we're talking about a top-level domain, for Publishers Clearinghouse, that would be pch.com, but a subdomain might be email.pch.com that may be delegated to a third-party marketer.
Exactly. So, we send our commercial email from Superprize, which is our big contest sweepstakes, .pch.com, email.pch.com. But our top-level domain, pch.com, everybody knows us as PCH. That we need to make sure is protected because that's where the Publishers Clearinghouse brand would be spoofed. On top of that, publishersclearinghouse.com. We don't send mail from publishersclearinghouse.com, but we still have that authenticated and with the appropriate reject flag to make sure that if anybody else tries to send from that domain, it's appropriately rejected.
Great. And the last question, again, can you explain what a park domain is?
A park domain is like publishersclearinghouse.com. We don't use that to send mail. We don't have a website that uses that. We own that, and we just keep it parked. We don't. It's not. We're not driving traffic to it. We're not sending email out from it. We just own it.
Right, and that's a good example. And I'd also encourage, at times you may have acquired a domain for a future purpose, and you may also, in that case, would publish a DMARC record that would and such to basically say no mail ever comes from that. So again, a lot of reasons for defensive registrations, for protecting your brand, copyright and such on there. Well, let's jump to the next section here, and it's a great overview, Sal. Infrastructure security. This is something that we've developed some APIs. We've partnered with Qualys Labs, SSL Labs, and other data providers that provide us a lot of data here. So we're really looking at how secure is that server that a user is visiting, and specifically the SSL connection part of it. So wherever you're logging in and what best practices you're adopting. So we look at that. We look at other technologies. We scan it. Is there, for example, a web app firewall? Can you exploit it with a bot? A lot of different areas. And then best practices such as extended validation certificates and always-on SSL, which I'll get into. Penalty points are, this is probably the biggest area of concern, is sites that have significant vulnerabilities. And I will say that we make best efforts to try to reach out, and this is the one area, if we see a significant vulnerability in a site that we believe that can put consumers at risk, we will try to reach out to those companies. We aren't there to be consultants and reconfigure their servers, but we think it's our responsibility for responsible disclosure there. And we've had more and more companies that have been actually been very responsive this year over previous years, so that's a good step there. So that's the security model. Here's a snapshot. This was a snapshot of our own site. Again, our tool is out there that anyone can use, and it's ota.sslabs.com, and you can go there and run any server and evaluate. So this is the point that if we can do that, so can your competitors, and so can the criminals. So when we did this report, this was done in March, we had an A+ rating. We were pretty happy. And the overall level had been raised significantly this year. And to my earlier point, when we're looking at the data, we've increased. So the lower 5 points, sites that did not have a SHA-1's signature associated with their certificate lost points. And I should mention that that's a simple thing. You just would need to go to your certificate authority and ask for a new certificate. And there's other exploits here that we can get into a little later. But again, we're constantly evaluating what are these best practices and how is the site performing. We take the grade from this and we incorporate that into our methodology as well as the other scoring mechanisms in there. And again, this year sites, the bar was raised significantly, as well as we have finer level gradation. So for example here, just using this tool, you could get 90 points if you had an A-. This year. That was added for more granularity. But I do want to point out, this is as of this week. This was about Monday of our own site. We went from an A+ to a B. And why is that? And this is the point that there are new vulnerabilities out there that have been identified. And so now if we were to do this evaluation, not only would OTA's score drop, but others as well. So in this case, there's something called the Diffie-Hellman key exchange parameter. There's information. You can click through this. Again, the URL is ota.sslabs.com. And the more information will actually give you the details on what you can do and patch. And this is a patch for an Apache server. It is something we're going to be doing this week ourselves. So again, it underscores that point that yesterday's best practices may no longer be applicable. One point I also want to talk about is always-on SSL, or HTTPS by default. This is one area that next year I fully expect this will become part of the baseline points. It's a best practice we've been advocating for several years. We have white papers, webinars on this. We're very happy to say that the FTC and the federal government, I should say in general, have published an edict that by December 31st of 2016, all federal sites must go to HTTPS by default. And so this is really important, and really what it does is secures the data, it encrypts the data between the client device and the website. So not just on your back end after you've registered. So if you haven't implemented Always On SSL, you should do this. The other point, if you aren't doing this, it will impact your SEO rating. Google and others have already said they will degradate sites who don't implement SSL or Always On SSL. So if you want your site to be found, if you want consumers to be able to reach it through search results, you had best implement as soon as possible. So not only for security, but from the marketing perspective as well. So let's look very quickly here on the summary scores. As Jeff mentioned before, we have a good concentration of scores here. It's great to see banks have the overall highest if you look at in the EV area, and they also have implemented the highest in Always On SSL. And I think the area that Always On SSL, the banks have recognized that in all the data that's being exchanged and typed, the importance of privacy and security is really high there. Not surprisingly, we see numbers closer to the 10 or 15% in other segments there. So that's the highlights we have right now. The concerns are the vulnerabilities, and our recommendation is that sites should be looking at their scoring and using tools like these and others on a monthly basis. And again, you have to keep pace with it. And all too often, these are simple things of either disabling or enabling a security protocol. The SHA-2, which will be required soon, again, only 51% have adopted the SHA-2 certificate. So this is really important. So it's already been identified that SHA-1 has could be exploited. And so here's an example. Companies need to be thinking about that. Always On SSL, and I guess the last point here again is these are often operational disciplines versus technical resources. It's not like having to buy new software. All too often, again, it's keeping focus on this and on top of that. Sal, I know you've been looking at this yourself and your sites, and any lessons that you can share on the site security side?
Yeah, this is an area that I think OTA members and all consuming applications of the advertising arena can begin to put pressure on the advertising networks to move towards supporting Always On SSL. Craig mentioned earlier that Google is enforcing Always On SSL. Not all ad networks are currently able to support Always On SSL. So it's sort of leaving publishers in the middle ground of, well, do I lose Google? Do I lose an ad network? And I think we as, I made Craig fall off his chair.
No, I'm fine.
And I think we as publishers and as consumers of these networks, as a unified voice, we need to be more demanding of the networks and to move towards this standard so that we can achieve it. Because again, it's not a complicated execution. It just needs to be supported across your site.
Oh, great, Sal. And I do, there's a lot of resources that we have, as well as if you go to our site, and we'll have the link at the end. Many of our members, including Symantec and DigiCert and GlobalSign and others, have resources and papers as well. So it's something that I guess as one of the key takeaways is all sites should be starting their planning for this now. So let's the last section is privacy, and again, as indicated by Jeff, this is an area that is one of the 3 pillars. Combined, it can have up to 100 points, and it's split between scoring of the privacy policy, and the other 50 points is based on what's actually occurring on the site. For the privacy policy, this is actually a manual process where we actually review each privacy policy and we score it, starting with 50 points, and then you lose points if certain areas aren't covering your privacy policy. And then the tracking part of it, relies on data from our analysis and others that looks at what's actually occurring on your site. And as Jeff mentioned, that some sites are very pure and they have no third-party data collection, which is positive. And others, we observed some sites that had over 200 third parties that were actively collecting data on site users. And if we're thinking about trust, while we understand that's important for driving advertising and driving ad revenue in certain areas, it also has an implication on users' collection of their data. So we have that in there. We also have a lot of bonus points, and we want to see the privacy policies move from this compliance mindset to one of stewardship. So if we looked at, this gives a snapshot of the scores. For example, on the left is a total score out of 100, and the news sites obviously have the lowest as a result of their tracking score. Privacy policies, you see this range up there. Again, in a privacy policy, is it discoverable? Is it intuitive? Does it address data collection, data sharing, data retention, disclosures, and other points? Those are some of the key areas, and all that methodology is spelled out on our website. And then we also look at some additional third parties. There are technologies called tag management systems and privacy solutions out there that help sites manage third-party data collection. So we look for those that code if it's on the site. And what's interesting is obviously the top 100 retailers do a tremendous amount of tag management. Of course, in their case, they want to look at referrals, where the leads are coming from, where consumers are coming from, so they've invested in that technology. Not surprisingly, banks are only 22%, or I should say government are only 22%, but they're obviously not looking for that information. So you see this big range among different segments here. But again, that's a bonus point. If we look at the specific attributes of a privacy policy that we think are very important, again, above and beyond what may be regulated, is a layered notice. And a layered notice is really that short, concise, staccato statement that provides clear notice to the consumer that's easy to digest and understand. So that's where you see, again, 43% of the top 100 retailers have adopted. On the other hand, it's disappointing only 10% of the Internet of Things companies, so that's concerning. Use of icons, we'll touch on that. Again, the idea of a user-friendly interface that's easily comprehensible. We'll share some examples. Bilingual privacy policies. You know, the world is not English-based, and we think it's important. So sites, even if your site content is English, you may consider other languages. And we believe, for example, in OTA's instance, we've actually have our privacy policy also in Spanish. So again, looking at the range here to encourage that. And the whole idea is if you're trying to convey and communicate complex issues on data privacy, shouldn't you be doing that in the native language that's the first language of the site visitor and your customer? And then the last part is the do not track disclosure. So many sites don't understand this, but state of California requires any site that has a consumer in the state of California to have a do not track disclosure as part of the privacy policy. Basically, what this means is if a user has set their do not track setting on their browser, the website is required to tell the consumer, do they respect that, or how do they respect that? So many sites, because it's an evolving standard, haven't implemented anything yet. But the reality is you're required by state law to do that, and we have examples of privacy policy copy that you may want to consider that on your site here. So again, those are key areas there. But you know, I mentioned icons, and Sal, maybe you can kind of share what you've done and kind of your privacy policy makeover.
Sure, we did this a couple of years ago, and we had the traditional long legalese type privacy policy like everybody had, and we worked with a variety of organizations. You'll see trustee listed up there as well as the OTA. And looked at not only meeting our legal obligations, but making it more consumer friendly. You know, the people that click over to a privacy policy are very few, and we wanted to make it as easy for them as possible. So we took the approach of going with, icons so they can quickly get to the section they want to. They can read the highlights there or go into the full privacy policy. We thought it was a good idea. It was a best practice to do so, and for those members clicking into it, we wanted them to get back to our site as soon as possible. So that's what we did.
Yeah, I think, and the point here is it's all about transparency. It's all about being really open to consumer, and again, providing them information, taking a complex concept and making it really digestible. And so again, in each one of these things, you can see the learn more, read more, to provide that full context in here. There's other approaches that can be done. Some sites just have a summary on the top, and with bookmarks or hyperlinks down below within a page. There's different approaches there, but again, this is what we consider a best practice. I have a question about getting icons, and OTA does not have icons. There's no standardized icons out there today, but there are different sites out there you can get and create and such on there. So, so again, if there's more questions on that, happy to help on any area there. So great work, Sal. So I think as we, some of the concerns, I think we touched on here. I think in general, some of the privacy policy statements are still being written by attorneys for attorneys. And I certainly understand the companies want as much latitude as possible for future uses. But we need to really be thinking about in this day and age is respecting consumers' rights and understanding, and really looking at data as an asset and really understand who owns it. And the concern here is in the absence of it, upwards of 25% of users are now using ad blockers because they're concerned about their privacy. And so as marketers, I think it beholds our long-term interest of taking a step forward and really being candid with consumers of what you're doing with their data so they can have a better level of trust and confidence in your site. So we have some time. We're going to wrap it up here real quick here. So what are some of the next steps? Again, I think, and Sal, you've mentioned a few times, this is not static. It's not a one-time thing you walk away from. Look at your site, your configuration, your mail streams, and your privacy policies. But Sal, how do you on this area here? But whose job is that within the company? Is it just the IT guy, or is it just you, or who should be doing this work?
Well, really, it falls on the under my umbrella, but across the entire company, we've all got security and privacy, and the users in the forefront of everyone's thinking. So whereas there's an organizational structure with a title of compliance officer within our company, really falls within the entire organization. And we've got IT dedicated resources and part-time resources. But it's really, the good thing is it doesn't take a huge investment on the part of an organization, because there are organizations like the OTA, and I see you have get involved with the OTA, that provides an awful lot of support for understanding and keeping up with what's happening new, because this is not a static environment. It's constantly changing as new threats evolve, as standards change, as FTC comes out with new guidances, and Congress and Senate are constantly coming out with new standards. How does one keep up with it all? Well, either you hire an army or you rely on organizations that do this. And we are very grateful to the OTA for assisting us through this challenge.
Well, Sal, I think one of the points that I appreciate that comment, though. I suggest it's one of the things that I've seen that you guys do and other brands is you've basically made every employee responsible in a sense. So if marketing is going out and hiring a new vendor to do, or an affiliate marketer, they know that marketer needs to adhere to your standards and practices, and they need to go through that assessment on bringing on a third party.
Correct.
So I think that is a great steps there. So for resources here, we've given a lot of information here, and I want to thank everyone for joining the call today. If you have any other last comments, you can certainly put them into the chat window, and we'll try to take the efforts here and share back with you. We have a lot of resources up here. Again, if you need some other advice, certainly you can email me or just email admin@otalliance.org. We'll put information up there and answer. We will be posting this deck and webinar by the end of the day today. And if you have any other questions, please let us know. And I think the last point, again, I want to thank Sal and Jeff for their guidance and input over the past several years on this progress. And for all of the members and attendees on the call who have contributed to the methodology and the recommendations. And we look forward to that feedback as we move forward. And certainly your feedback as attendees if you have other suggestions on how we can better improve online trust, and most importantly, consumer confidence and the innovation in the marketplace. So thank you very much, and appreciate your feedback, and look forward to connecting with you on the next webinar.